Our superintendent's report 5.02, Dr. Kellogg.
I'm starting to feel like the John Kellogg show tonight. I apologize for that. I wanted to provide the board and our community some information related to our comments on the Education Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. So I'll read from this. Last Thursday afternoon, I took the opportunity to testify to Ohio's Joint Education Oversight Committee in regard to the proposed Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. This is the federal plan. And this was a response to Ohio's application, Ohio Department of Education's application of their draft application for ESSA. And so I'm going to provide the community the opportunity to hear what I presented to that committee just as information. And we'll put some stuff on the website as well related to this. And before I do that, talk specifically about Ohio's ESSA proposal and some of the very specific recommendations our leadership team formulated and presented. I want to talk about a more general observation for consideration, and that would be this. Why are we so focused on developing an ESSA plan that meets the requirements of the federal government? Why aren't we more focused on a world-class plan for Ohio's education system? Shouldn't that be our priority before meeting the expectations of ESSA? So for the last 13 months, ODE went through a community engagement process with a foundation group to have meetings, stakeholder meetings all across the state to discuss the components of ESSA. And for me, as I said to the committee, that seems like the low-end assignment. The big assignment is what's our plan for Ohio, and then how does that use as a basis for our ESSA application? And so really, for me, the question should have been, what do Ohio citizens want from their public schools? And the answer to that question could then be used to frame the ESSA proposal. Now, I say that, and then I either look like a genius or have egg on my face, because I got a report today, the state superintendent, through ODE, has laid out a strategic plan for Ohio. I'll take the egg on the face because I don't think that my comments last Thursday generated a response that quickly. So Ohio is in the process of doing that and fitting the ESSA plan in, and I appreciate that, and I look forward to having opportunities, and I hope our community does, and we'll try and organize some real opportunities to participate in that. But still, for me, I think a horse is behind the cart for me. Yeah, I got that right. So put that aside. And then, so just specific to ESSA, our general response is that it takes advantage of some of the allowances provided under ESSA that call for greater state and local school district control over education. However, as I read through the document, as we read through the document, we listen to stakeholders across Ohio, there's still a significant gap between proposed changes and the concerns of our stakeholders at the local level. So here are some very specific recommendations that we made as a leadership team to legislators, to the policymakers, and to ODE specific to ESSA. First one, regarding challenging academic standards, which is the lead of this, we agree. Challenging academic standards that reflect college and career readiness, appropriate. And we also appreciate the efforts to continue to engage educators and other stakeholders in the development and review of those standards. That's something Ohio has done traditionally and something ODE has done a pretty good job on, even through some of the conversation related to Common Core and the federal influence there. Ohio has its own standards. One of the pieces of the application references career technical education, and here's a place where we saw a need to comment. The ESSA proposal notes that this is an underutilized graduation pathway, and we would agree, it is an underutilized pathway. But recent efforts to change standards and requirements for career technical education graduations, that's not going to increase enrollment. In fact, that's becoming a deterrent. And what we would ask is that local career technical education superintendents and principals, along with business and industry leaders, should have a greater voice in determining which assessments and performance levels should be used for the industry credential standards. That's one of the ways a student can graduate, if they have industry recognized credentials. And the authority for those determinations shouldn't rest so much in ODE, but should be given back to career technical folks and local businesses, and that's not the case. As an example, some of the industry credentials that our students are eligible for to graduate as a pathway, you can't even take the test until you're 18. If you can't take test till you're 18, you may not take tests after graduation. Some of those assessments aren't offered while the kids are in school. And some of the assessments, as you look through it now, I would encourage people who are interested in career technical education, look at ODE's website at those. I just don't think they're the best measures for kids, but they're in there. And that's a real shift on how that was done through ODE, and we would recommend more local control there. Aligned academic assessments. This is probably the biggest hoopla in Ohio and nationally. We would say that Ohio's proposal does not adequately address the issue of time spent on state assessments. To quote from the draft overview that ODE put together from the stakeholder meetings, quote, stakeholders express an interest in continuing to explore further reduction in testing. But as you read the ESSA proposal, what they're saying is, although under ESSA we could reduce the number of assessments that we give by 7, we're going to leave it as is. And then we'll talk about whether or not as is appropriate. And our recommendation would be start at the minimum and then have the conversation relative to Ohio as to whether or not we need additional assessments and for what purposes and where. That's 7 assessments that would be off the plate. Somebody calculated the Ohio dollars associated with those 7 assessments that are not required, and I think that's a good discussion. Although more importantly, is it aligned to our outcomes? The other one that's referenced, and you hear this a lot, this whole issue about time on tests. If you remember, one of the things that ODE was saying during that time period is they were looking at calculating how much time for testing. They kept referencing local districts' assessment calendars and the time spent on those as well. That's our and our local community's decision. Stay out of it. It doesn't need to be referenced in ESSA, and it shouldn't be part of the state policymakers' decisions. That's between us and our community and what we need to measure what's important to us. So don't impose state limitations. And last one is, Ohio must fully examine the impact of online assessments on student performance. We must account for any variables associated with moving to online assessments and their impact on student performance. There was a great article recently in the Dispatch regarding whether or not third graders taking online tests is an appropriate form for them to take that test. Are they ready for that? And we know that this is an issue. The other place we saw it play out heavily in this across the state was the impact in value-added performance of school districts. In that many school districts saw a significant drop in their value-added score as they went to online testing. And the difference in value-added scores across the state between districts that were online versus districts that were paper pencil was clearly disparate, with the advantage being pencil and paper. We saw it internally here in that our first year we were paper and pencil on all assessments except for 2. And on the 2 we were online, we had miserable value-added scores, drops in our value-added scores. Every place else we were fine. The second year when we were required to go to online, our value-added performance dropped from an A to an F, which is the equivalent of saying teachers put down their chalk and didn't teach for a year, or kids didn't open a book. There's something not right about the score. So we got to look at this online assessment and its impact. In regard to the report card, there's a clear disconnect between ODE's statement that the current report card system is, quote, nationally heralded for its comprehensive, innovative, and easy to understand structure. I don't think this aligns with public sentiment. In fact, the 30-something page full report card also requires a 30-something page addendum to explain to you the components of the report card. That's not maybe comprehensive. I don't think it has an easy to understand structure. And while there's a lot of elements that we think are effective, we think there's elements that are meaningless and confusing. The A to F system is not very good. It does not really communicate to people performance. We all have embedded in our brains what A, B, C, D, E, F is. We've seen the problems. We would recommend, as many school districts have, just go to an exceeds, meets, or fails to meet with a progress component in there. That's a lot easier for everybody to understand and compare apples and oranges. Indicators met, gap closure, good measures, but there's frequent changes to assessments, performance standards, the number of indicators, so that makes all of that confusing. That needs to be settled down. One of the areas that is concerning to many school districts and to us, and this is a little known piece, currently if a school or a district for a student subgroup has a sample size, an N size of less than 30, it's considered statistically insignificant and not graded. They're dropping, the recommendation is to drop the N size to 15. I'm okay with providing the data for all the kids, even if there's fewer than 15 in the population. I'm not sure applying a grade to the data makes sense when what you're talking about is a statistical population n size that's not relevant, that's not statistically relevant. So why do that? Give me the data. It's an effort by the state to make sure that some populations of students aren't being removed from the data because you don't have an n size of 30. I understand that. Give me the data. I don't need a grade if I only have 5 kids in a subgroup. I need the data. Progress or growth, I mentioned before, is problematic. It's a great measure if you understand it. However, confidence in the current measurement continues to diminish. And that's because the way of measuring progress, there's 52 different ways of doing it. Every model is different. And depending on which model you're choosing, your outcome is different and the variables are different. We would ask for a third-party independent review of Ohio's current metric to make sure that it is the most robust and most fair in measuring that outcome for students. Because this isn't a measure that's on the district report card, building report card, and is by law at this point a component of teacher and principal evaluation up to 50% on a metric that has lost, we've lost confidence in. So it needs to be the right metric if we're going to measure people that way. K-3 literacy. The K-3 literacy measure just needs, it's useless. I'll just say it that way, it's useless. We have a greater than 99% pass rate on third grade reading guarantee. Our third graders pass the third grade test and move on. But the K-3 literacy measures students in grades kindergarten, first and second, and where they are in reading at the start of the year and where they are at the end of the year. And that measurement, we get an F. It's the equivalent of saying, it's the equivalent of this year's Super Bowl. At halftime, everybody turned off the TV because it was done. At the end of the third quarter, many people turned off the TV because it was done. At the end of third grade, it wasn't done, right? So we have a lot of effort on literacy. We grow our kids. They make tremendous improvements. Those coaches, our reading teachers, our staff do a great job there. And when we get to third grade, we get it done. The measure, the K-3 literacy measure, if you go look at it, it's useless. Get rid of it. Prepared for Success has some merit, but has some flaws. These are things like what percentage of your kids took AP classes. I don't know. What percentage of my kids should take college curriculum in high school? But we're getting a grade. What percentage of my kids should be accessing college credit through College Credit Plus? What percentage of our kids should be in International Baccalaureate and taking the test? I don't know. I don't know of any research that says it's X percentage of kids. But we're getting measured on it, which is good. I don't need a grade. I don't need a grade on that measurement. You can do two different things. So we think that needs some work. And the last one, this is a new one that's an interesting one. ESSA allows states to add their own component around a measure of school quality. Great idea. Here's the problem. Ohio's plan calls to measure school quality in terms of student engagement. Their data points for student engagement are related to student attendance and student discipline, which is not a direct reflection of student engagement. In fact, it's a reflection of lots of different things, including school quality and student engagement. But there's other larger factors at play there that are measurements. So to use that measurement, I think is problematic. I don't particularly like it. The other one they've talked about is a statewide school climate survey. Sounds like another state test and more time to me. So I'm not sure I like either of those measures. I think there's better. I think if we take time, we can come up with better measurements. The last two pieces we talked about was the Ohio improvement process. This is for those schools that are designated for intervention at the state level and various levels. The model they use, the framework for improvement, is the Ohio improvement process. This is a framework that is grounded in evidence-based research on the effectiveness of using formative instruction and use of district building and teacher teams to use student data to design instruction and to deliver interventions. It's a great model. The problem is the compliance side that's coming from the state just makes implementation very, very difficult. For us, for example, we learned in August that all of our buildings had to comply and be part of the Ohio improvement process. So all of our teachers and principals had to start putting things in place to meet the mandate. There was never a discussion about the legitimacy and the impact and the evidence surrounding using teacher-based teams and formative assessment to improve outcomes. So what we have is people complying without having a belief system around this is the right thing to do. and that's problematic. The last one has to do with teacher and principal evaluation, and a sidebar, the state superintendent charged the Education Standards Board with coming up with some recommendations to improve the current evaluation system that's in law. There are 6 recommendations that were made by that board, one of which included getting rid of the student growth measure as a separate 50% component of evaluation and embedding it just in the rubric. The rubric already speaks to teachers' use of formative assessment as part of the instructional process. It's already in the evaluation, so it's not hard to build into the evaluation the use of that data. We don't need a separate 50% component that, if you look at the system, provides for a lot of inequities, a lot of confusion, a lot of time and compliance that aren't very helpful. So we would encourage them to adopt those 6 recommendations as quickly as possible. So we look forward to seeing what they do. The state is at an interesting crossroads. There are 2 submission deadlines. One is April. Many of the people testifying when I were there advocating for Ohio not to push to submit in April, but to submit in September. ODE put out a document talking about why they thought it was more appropriate to go in April. I'm of the position, let's get it right, not let's just get it done. I think a longer waiting period, particularly if you're going to couple that to your strategic planning efforts. If you look at the timeline there, it would seem to me it would make some sense to tap the brakes, get the big picture right, so that the little picture feeds. And I think there's lots of concerns with the system overall in Ohio that are not components of ESSA, that simply focusing on ESSA will solve the ESSA-related problems, but not all the issues we have in Ohio. And I think that the whole picture should be addressed. So that's a summary of the comments we provided. I appreciated having that opportunity. I appreciate the board's efforts to help inform the comments. I thought your understanding of these issues as a team and understanding ESSA was really, really deep and really, really helpful in formulating our opinion. And I look forward to seeing where Ohio goes in the future. So happy to take any questions about it or comments, and that's where we're at. We'll put something out on the website for folks so they have more information as well.
I'd just say a quick thank you to Dr. Nestor Baker and Dr. Kellogg. At our last meeting, in addition to the rest of the board members, in our last meeting, toward the end of the meeting, I threw Dr. Nestor Baker under the bus and said, you know, why don't you come up with something written for this ESSA thing, and we'll just kind of work on it that way. And verbally, she agreed to do that, and under her breath, she was speaking to me in some other language. No, she would tongues. Yes, no, and the very next day, just so you know, the kind of the timeline that we worked under here. The very next day, I got an email that said that the Joint Education Committee. Oversight Committee, yes, thank you. They were going to take some testimonies. And that's what I would call it in my testimonies. And so all of a sudden we had the chance to verbally go and present to them. And I think one of our public comments from that meeting suggested that we kind of move in that direction. So there were emails fast and furious. There was discussion of ESSA. There was a reading of a whole bunch of stuff. And so I let board comment on anything Dr. Kellogg shared. But I am just really grateful to Nancy for kind of diving in really quickly to that and allowing me to ask her to go in that direction. I didn't throw you in that direction.
Oh, you did
ask you to go in that direction, and Dr. Kellogg and then the rest of the board really reading emails over weekends and so on. So I am just very much of the opinion that whenever Westerville City Schools can speak and not just complain, that's a good thing. When we can say something, here's what we don't like, here's what we do like, this is what we're thinking. It's just easy for us to rail against the man. But for us to come together and to make some positive assertions about this is what we think can be done, work with us. I just was very proud of the way this came about.
Well, I do want to point out that in the end, I didn't have to write it, that John wrote it and Greg helped. But what I found most heartening in a lot of, well, there were two things I found very heartening, one internal and one at the Oversight Committee. As the components for John's comments began to come together, it was clear almost immediately that all of those comments built very specifically on things we had all discussed here. So it wasn't, making up positions in the dark of the night. It was talking about things that we have addressed and that John has brought forward and that we have all brought forward in past months. And when that became clear, things flowed very quickly. The other thing that I found particularly heartening was by the time John's name was called, we'd been sitting there, 4.5 hours, I think? Yeah. They gave him a 1:30 start time, and we got out of there about the time rush hour was over. And the rule when you testify is that you're not supposed to say the same things that other people said. Well, all of the people who went before him, and there were a number of other school districts there, were saying very similar things to what we said. And so John is there scribbling, trying to pull out the things that we had to say that were either clearer, more specific, or went in a slightly different direction. So he performed very well with that kind of flexibility and was really listened to. We do a lot of complaining and making our feelings known up here about things, but the room was utterly silent, and the committee did listen very carefully, in part because John gave some very specific examples. He explained as best he could in the very limited time that he had concerns that we have with the methodology around the report cards. He explained the impact of what the federal government has become in education over time, even gave him a little bit of Educational Administration 101. I talked a lot about local control and about what the role of the federal government is and should be. But the most important thing that seemed to resonate with everyone in the room was the comment about we don't need an ESSA plan, we need an Ohio plan. An ESSA plan should flow from an Ohio plan, not an Ohio plan from an ESSA plan. That is an important statement and sums up the feelings of so many people, not just here, but the people who were there in the committee room as well. So, John, I want to thank you for the work on that. I want to thank all the board members for their work on that. And also, I think it's really important to point out that it all came together from things that we already had spent a lot of time talking about.
And I'm going to piggyback on that. I'm going to be blunt and do my very best not to tip over into angry, because I know that folks that have been here when we've discussed these metrics measures, grading paradigms from the state, have heard my position on this very clearly. Let's be blunt for a second, and the way that the state board or the State Department of Education has portrayed their opening positions only reinforces the fact. When we look at the State Department of Education, the state superintendent, many of our legislators, and even our governor, we are surrounded by people that are trying to measure the temperature in public schools with a yardstick, right? There's no basic understanding of statistical analysis, evidentiary-based analysis. There's no good basic math, right? Everybody that has anything to do with continuous improvement in a business setting knows that if you go from an A to an F in the course of one time period, you don't look at it and go, wow, look how badly they failed. You look at that and go, if I look at the prior years, and now all of a sudden we've plummeted, that's an anomalous event and there must be an explanation. And I need to do analysis and investigate what happened. Never been a part of the state's conversation. Never. Never. You can't tell me that you can go from an A to an F based upon how this board has presented its mandates, its own resolutions over the course of the last several years. All of a sudden there was this change, and then in this particular category, the bottom fell out, right? It does not make sense. And it's frustrating to me that we have a State Department of Education that still does not acknowledge that they are not keeping their eye on the ball that matters, right? And they're not doing basic mathematics. The evidence is all there. It would be like the insurance companies ignoring 100 years worth of information about house fires. It doesn't make any sense. So I really am proud of this board for, and I'll emphasize what you said, Rick. We believe we have answers, and we don't believe, we have humility. We don't believe we're the only school district that has answers. But the fact of the matter remains that until the state acknowledges at the State Department of Education, at the governor's office level, that there is a problem in the basic manner of thinking that's being used to determine these models, it's not going to change. And the core of this, and you mentioned something I think is extremely critical. I advise some of the largest companies in the world, and I advise them on how to measure and monitor their performance specifically. That's what I do. And I find it fascinating that what's being articulated is something that you mentioned, a compliance model. There is no measuring of performance in a compliance-based model. It is simply a checklist to say, have you done this? Are you doing this? Are you doing one of these? There is no information from a compliance-based model that allows you to improve year on year. That's why it's called metrics and not compliance, right? So if we continue to see compliance-based models, we will continue to see division and frustration between local boards of education and our state overseers, because we are not comparing apples to apples. We're not comparing apples to oranges. We're comparing apples to aardvarks, right? We are just not on the same sheet of music when it comes to local control and education of our student population within our communities. And I guess I did tip into a little bit of angry. Sorry about that.
I think forceful, not angry, just forceful.
Any other comments? Thank you, Dr. Kellogg. Good report.